You are now listening to EdYOUcate, the most fired up educational podcast there is. EdYOUcate is all about the quality education access to students and how we can provide research-based solutions to free the young minds of the world. On this podcast, we will be exploring different educational experiences, education's greatest of debates, and more. The hottest educational podcast out. EdYOUcate is brought to you from the Albany State University's very own Center for Educational Opportunity. Enjoy.
All right, so in today's episode, we will be discussing culturally relevant teaching in mathematics. We have our special guest today, Shelly Jones. If you would like to just introduce yourself to the listeners and just give them a little bit of background knowledge about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Jamila, and thank you so much for the invitation. I also want to give a shout out and a thank you to Dr. Kathaleena Monds. She's actually my Spelman sister. So hi, Dr. Monds. And for the Center for Educational Opportunity, I thank you for this invitation. I am Dr. Shelly Jones. I am a professor of mathematics education at Central Connecticut State University. And I will say that this topic is very relevant to the fact that I am the first African American to earn full professorship at my university in the math department specifically. So I think that my topic today is going to be really relevant because so many people along the way, children and adults, have math anxiety. And I think teaching from a culturally relevant perspective is going to help to take that away. But we have a lot of work to do. Just a little bit more about myself. My background is that I was a middle school mathematics teacher first, actually computer science first, computer science programmer. But then most of my career has been in education. So I started off as a middle school math teacher in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and then as an administrator throughout some of the districts in Connecticut, and then professor, which is what I do now. Really, math teaching and learning is really what I love to do. And so that is my background.
All right, well, thank you for that. So first question I would like to ask is just for you to kind of give the listeners a little bit more information about what is culturally relevant teaching in mathematics.
So when I started off teaching, I taught in the city that I grew up in. And so although I didn't teach on the same side of town, I felt like the kids in front of me were sort of like my kids, right? Many teachers think that way anyway, but I think it's even more of a feeling when you grow up in the same town, that you work in the same town that you grow up in. You really have aspirations for those students. So I think back in the day when I was teaching back in the 90s, I really wanted my students to excel. I wouldn't take no for an answer. My students were engaged. And I remember I taught in a middle school, but we had, I say security guards, but I'm sure they were called something else back then. But we had security guards, and the security guard would say to me, Miss Jones, you never send anyone to the office. And I said, well, if I have a problem, I take care of it in my classroom. And he says, and you never have stuff on your floor at the end of the day. And I was like, what do you mean, paper? Like if they drop paper, they pick it up. My students aren't throwing things around, which is what I found out he was talking about. And I say that to say that when you respect children, when you honor children, when they can see that you have their best interests in mind, not just about passing the next test, but just who they are as people, then that, to me, is teaching from a culturally relevant perspective. I didn't know it back then, but I'm learning that that's what it means. So specifically, culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy is a pedagogy that empowers students intellectually, emotionally, socially, and politically by using cultural reference from their own communities. It's a way of teaching that honors students and what they bring to the classroom. So you're using cultural reference in order to teach math. Now that is what takes some doing. I think most teachers, I would say, probably all teachers care about their students, but do you care enough about them to start from them in your teaching, not from what the curriculum says. Sure, we want to get at the curriculum, but we got to start with the students in front of us. So there's 3 tenets to culturally relevant teaching pedagogy, and it's academic excellence. So yeah, we're going to start with cultural reference, but we're going to make sure we teach those math standards. We still want the math to be rigorous. We still want the math to be cognitively demanding. We want students to have to think. We want students to know that faster doesn't mean smarter. There's a book by Kathy Seeley by that name, Faster Isn't Smarter, because some kids think doing things fast in math means you're smarter. No, we want kids to be innovative, creative. We want them to learn math and understand it, not just get answers real fast, right? What is it? Write equations real fast and solve equations. Okay, that's part of math, but you don't have to do it fast. You know, we are teaching little kids. Tracy Zager has a book, and it's Becoming the Math Teacher You Wish You Had. And basically what she talks about in that book is we want to teach children what mathematicians really do. And they don't sit there and solve problems really fast. In fact, it takes them sometimes the whole day, sometimes weeks, sometimes years to figure out a math problem, because a lot of times they're trying to figure out a math problem in an innovative way or a different way. So when kids learn how to solve a problem one way, we say, well, can you solve it a different way? Because then we know they're not just memorizing the teacher's way. So academic excellence is one of the tenets. The other tenet, which you would never think this in math, but the other tenet is cultural competence. If kids don't know who they are themselves, then how can they do math? Because we're all mathematical beings. You wouldn't know that. Sometimes even when you ask a second grader, they'll say, oh, I'm not good at math. Well, no, that's not true. You do math every day. You estimate, you predict, you have schedules that you follow. Your parents may cook using recipes sometime. And even when they don't have to measure with a measuring cup, they know ratios. They know for every cup of rice, I have to use 2 cups of water or vice versa, right? So they know that ratio is kind of like a 2-to-1 ratio, two cups of water to every 1 cup of rice. So they're using ratios. But if we don't tell kids that that's what that is, they don't think that that's math. They don't think their mom is doing math when their mom is doing lots of math. You know, what about fixing cars? Very mathematical. There's so much math that we do. What about mowing the lawn? We could talk about area and perimeter. What about putting a fence in the yard? We can talk about perimeter. What's the biggest area that you can get if you have a fence that's 40 feet long? Hello. You can have different shapes. So if we can help kids to make connections to what they already do in their homes and communities, then we can help them to feel like they're mathematical. So the cultural competence is helping kids to learn about themselves. Sometimes that means seeing mathematicians that look like them, helping them to learn about their communities, the issues in their communities. We can use mathematics to solve problems. We do it all the time. Well, what about the problems in your own community? How can we use math to highlight those and to highlight the inequities that we see? So that's cultural competence, and then critical consciousness. So the critical consciousness is the part that I didn't know about as a teacher, and I'm learning about it now as a professor, is kids need to understand that there's inequities in the world. I think they already know. Like if you ask even a little kid about what's fair and not fair, they know. They'll tell you what's fair and what's not fair. Hey, these days we hear it on the TV all the time, on the news, about what's not fair, about inequalities and inequities. So those kinds of things that's critical consciousness, meaning kids can use math to sort of analyze things and data that is not fair. You know, the funding of schools. You know, why do some schools have so much? It's plentiful. All the kids have laptops and then other schools don't. They barely even have good textbooks. So a critical consciousness means students should not accept the status quo, even little children. There was one episode where this teacher taught her kindergarten class, it might have even been pre-K, about Rosa Parks and about how it wasn't fair that Rosa Parks had to get off the bus. Well, kids know what's fair. If you let kids join a group and then say, oh, sorry, we don't have enough room, you can't join this group, kids feel like sad, and they know that that means that's unfair. Why can I not join that group? There's room over there. Why can I not join? And so the kids got on the bus and put the penny in the jar. And then when they got off the bus, they took the penny out, and they were learning how to add one and subtract one, but they were learning it through the story of Rosa Parks. And they were learning it at a level relevant to them in pre-K and K. So we can teach even small kids what's right and wrong. In fact, we do that as parents, but we can use mathematics many times to help them to understand it as well. Or we could use mathematics in a way like when they were doing the Rosa Parks, they were learning about what's fair and what's not fair, but they were also learning how to add one penny and subtract one penny, take one away. And so that's critical consciousness, is when students don't accept the status quo, but they say, well, why is it like that? And they begin to explore why things are the way they are, because sometimes we think things have to be this way because they've always been that way. But that's not true. Sometimes we can make changes if we can voice our opinions, right? There was one group, they were like middle or high school, and they looked at their neighborhood and they counted the number of package stores that sell alcohol, liquor, and those kinds of things. And then they looked at movie theaters, and they looked at, what do they call it, like a community center. And they counted the number of places, those locations, right? But then they took the bus out to another neighborhood that was more of a suburban neighborhood and did the same thing, and found out that why is it that we have more package stores in our neighborhood than that other neighborhood? And they begin to ask questions. Some people don't want students to know those things. They don't want students to ask questions. But those are the questions that they need to understand so that they can become adults that can really make changes in their communities. It starts very young, and students are asking things at younger ages these days. So why do we have to hide those things from them? Why can't they learn all the different sides of what's going on, and then they can begin to make decisions as they grow old enough to make those kind of decisions? Sometimes it's just a matter of writing to your school board, writing to your principal, why you think something's not fair, writing to your teacher, or even to your parents. You know, my dad found a letter that I wrote as a middle schooler, somewhere between middle and high school. And it was so funny how I was making my argument to him, Daddy, I don't think this is fair because, and they learn how to make these arguments. And in mathematics, we have this thing, the standards for math practice. And one of the standards is we want students to be able to make arguments in mathematics and rationalize and say and justify their answers. How do I know my answer's right? Just because I get the answer and hand it in to the teacher should say, well, how do you know that that's right? Why did you do it that way? Even if it's right or wrong, the teacher should still say, how do you know? So the student has to justify their answer. So those are the 3 tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy.
Wow, you said a lot of great things. And as you were talking, I just had like a lot of different questions just come past my mind, and even things that I've experienced in high school or middle school and even elementary school. One of the things that I wanted to point out was when I think it was the second tenet, when you were making the connection between real life and mathematics. Mm-hmm. And many times, I think you use the example of cooking and, even like mowing the lawn. Those are things that we naturally do every day, depending on what your chores are. Mm-hmm. And no one looks at it as if this is something that, you are learning in math, but you're still applying to your everyday life. And so many times I remember my classmates saying, I'm never going to use math, or I'm never going to use this in life. And it doesn't matter if I learn it. And also what you said about not just getting the right answer just to turn it in for a test or for an assignment, but actually understanding why you've gotten the answer right. And so I just wanted to say that it's true, and to know that there are ways that students can learn math and love it, because there are a lot of students that don't like math. Yes. Because they don't know, or don't think that they can comprehend it, and they don't think that it applies to their lives. But the sooner that they realize that, then math can be lovable for them. And so I guess like this leads straight into my next question about how we can broaden the way that students see mathematics, and what can we include as contributions to, of diverse people in mathematics. And, I know you had mentioned about Rosa Parks, which is great because now we're bringing in, the interdisciplinary subjects, and now we're mixing in social studies, which is great for them to see. It's great for them to see, math outside of just math class, and they're able to, see it in the world that they live in.
Yes.
And so as I'm asking this question, I feel like that brings in anti-racism in math. And so to, sum up the whole question, which includes a lot of what you were already saying, how can we allow students to see math in themselves and in the world that they live in, along with everything that's going on with, racism and even COVID? Like, how can we help them?
Wow. I was writing things down because your questions just sparked so many ideas in my head about things that I've seen to help connect, math with students. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So broadening the idea of what math is, we have to start from a young age asking students more questions, right? Questioning them. What they do nowadays is they'll show students a picture. Let's say a picture of, like, there's this fence near my house and it's made of rocks. It's a rock fence and the rocks are different sizes. And I can just show that picture to students and say, what do you notice? Give them some time, write down what they notice. They can notice, oh, the fence makes a rectangle, or, oh, there's different size rocks, or, oh, it looks like there's about 50 rocks, so there all these things that students can say. Some students will say something you didn't even think of and has nothing to do with the math that you want to do, but they contributed and they were engaged. So you write down everything they say about what they notice. And then you say, well, what do you wonder? And then they might say, I wonder if they use rocks around the whole house, because I only showed them a segment. I wonder if they use rocks around the whole house, how many rocks would they need? I wonder, do they get the rocks from in their backyard or do they buy the rocks? There's all these things they can wonder about. And then based on that, you do your lesson. Your lesson could be, how do you buy rocks? How much they cost. It could be about area. It could be about the perimeter of the house. So there's so many things that you can get from that one picture. So that's one thing. And you always show students things that they would just see in their normal day. You might show them a picture of a house and you say, what do you notice? They might notice that the roof is a triangular prism. They might notice that, and they might not say that word, but however they explain it, you can tell them, oh, well, that's a triangular prism. They might notice that, oh, there's 6 windows. They might notice the windows are rectangular, or they might notice, oh, that's a pretty window. It's a hexagon. And they might not say hexagon, but you're taking what they notice and you're changing it over into math language. So if we can get kids to connect to their everyday lives, that we can help them to see that there's math all around them. Now, there's certain topics in math like geometry. We could talk about quilting. There was a teacher, Jackie Leonard. Well, Jackie Leonard is the researcher, and she worked with a teacher in Philadelphia, and I think they were about 4th grade. And she taught 4th grade. And the teacher, I don't remember the teacher's name, but she wanted to connect students' creativity with math and with language arts. So she had them write a poem about themselves and make a quilting square that represented them. So there was something personal on the quilting square. And with quilts, you can talk about area and perimeter. You can also talk about things like transformations, meaning if I have something over here, can I make a reflection over here? A reflection is a transformation. It's a change of location. So I can take this same quilting square and reflect it over here, or I can rotate it so it's there. So you can take that quilt that's creative, it's personal to the students, and you can bring math into it by talking about transformations. Some the younger kids might say slides, flips, and turns, but I would say a translation is a slide, a flip is a reflection, and a turn is a rotation. So you bring the correct math vocab in at some point. You could also talk about the Underground Railroad and connect it to literature or social studies, like you were saying, interdisciplinary. What about art? I had a student that, didn't seem engaged when I taught the 8th grade, and he would sit in the back of the room and, he just wasn't engaged. And one day I went back there and saw that he was drawing. And I noticed that this kid was drawing like just from scratch, just by hand. But yet it was basically, he was an artist. At the age of 12, I would call Larry an artist. I would say, you are an artist. Okay, so what we're going to do with that is you're going to lead our next lesson on transformations, but we're going to do enlargements. We're going to do enlargement. So we took something from the cartoons in the newspaper and they cut it out, and he chose a snake. And we took that little snake and we used a coordinate grid, X and Y. And we, you go over 5 and you go up 8 and you make a dot. And so what they did was they recreated that snake on a big piece of paper. And then we put the snake on our door. And that was our door decoration for that month. But we were bringing in the math. Let's see, what else? So there's something called, I talked about transformations. There's something called tessellations. And you can even bring in culture. They have Islamic tessellations where they're different designs. They're beautiful. And they show all these transformations, slides, flips, and turns. I talked about that. What about street art? There was a teacher in Atlanta and saw some street art. It was this guy, I don't know, an artist drew this man on the wall, and it was cinder block. And so the cinder block acted as the X and Y axis. And so the same way they took it from a big wall, you can bring it down to a little piece of paper by shrinking it. So we enlarged it with Larry, but then we shrunk it with the teacher. And you can do that. There's lots of music, math and music. If you think about quarter notes and half notes and whole notes. And if you know music, a dotted note means whatever the note is before it plus half of that. So with the dotted note, if I have a quarter note, I have a quarter note plus what's half of a quarter, an eighth note. So, I mean, you can bring it in. Sometimes it means that the teacher has to learn some things as well, right? I didn't know all these things, but as you search for ways to connect your students, Gloria Latson-Billings coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy. And she also created a course. I don't remember the name of the course, but it basically talked about rap and poetry. It was the spoken word, and she connected that to mathematics. And so they were doing their poetry like Amanda Gorman, but they were connecting it to mathematics. I don't know exactly how they were doing it, but I'm sure there's ways of doing that. And she talked about how the course was very creative, innovative, and how she thought the math students would stick to just the math part and let their partner, the more artistic person, do all the art. And she found out that wasn't true, that there's a lot of mathematicians that love music, that are musicians as well, that are artists as well. And so if you can find the connection and the intersection between these different topics that students are interested in, sports. Giannis, I think you call his name, that just won the NBA finals. Okay. But anyway, if you can find the connection between sports, there's so much math in basketball and the angles that they throw up the basketball and they pivot and do those things. If you can find that, you got the sweet spot for that student, then you got them. You connect it to them. Once you connect to them and you show that you care, you got them. Because then they're going to want to please you. Plus, it's interesting to them. I mean, a lot of students don't like math because it's just not interesting to them. You got to make it interesting. Robert Moses, He does something called the Algebra Project. He makes algebra interesting to students by bringing in their real life. There's ways of doing it. You have to seek it out. And I know when you get to college, sometimes we feel like it's more difficult, and it probably is, but I found a book that talks about social justice and math, and it's for the college. It's for the college level. So you can find it. It's out there. You just got to look for it.
Wow. Well, I think that was really great. Like a lot of examples that you gave to connect everyday life things and everyday life interests that students have to their actual, curriculum and math. And so thank you for all the examples. And it just makes me think on how, like you said it best, you have to, as a teacher, search beyond the curriculum maps or the pacing guides to really dig deep to make those connections with the students. And they will love you for it because, like you said, they know that you care. And so I kind of want to shift in our conversation and just talk about STEM as a whole, but individually mathematics for females. And STEM is a very common acronym, and many know that it stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But a lot of people may not know everything that goes into being a woman of color and interested in these STEM topics. And so I will also like to just, leave the space open for you to talk about your book, Women Who Count, and just your experience as an educator, but also an African-American woman of color interested in mathematics.
Sure. Oh, wow. Women Who Count. So I became interested in writing the book when I saw the movie Hidden Figures. But in actuality, even before Hidden Figures, the movie, there was the book. And the book features more Black women from NASA than does the movie. The movie just focuses on 3 of the women, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. In the book, I like to focus also on Christine Darden, who she was an expert in sonic boom minimization. And she is actually still doing talks, even though she's retired from NASA. She's still doing talks today. She has one coming up at the MAA Math Fest in August of 2021. And so she's still talking about her experiences at NASA. But what I will say is what I learned about the women in my book. I feature 29 mathematicians in my book, and I have a biography of each of the women, and I have either a sketch or a photo. So I have the first 3 African-American women to earn doctorates in math: Euphemia Lofton-Haynes, Evelyn Granville, and Marjorie Brown. So I have the first 3. But then after that, I featured some pioneers who are in mathematics. And then I have the unhidden figures, which is what I call them now. And then I have the contemporary first. And what I like about the contemporary first is even in the 2000s, there are still Black women making first in mathematics. Like I said, I'm the first Black person in the math department at CCSU to get full professorship. And it seems like that shouldn't be a big deal, but it's a big deal. We're still making first. Dr. Talitha Washington, she's the inaugural director of the Data Science Initiative at the AU Center, Atlanta University Center. So we're still making first. She was also the first Black person at the University of Connecticut to earn a PhD in math, and that was just in 2001. And the reason I say that is I think women, little boys and girls, need to know that whatever they want to do, they can do, and they can actually be the first to do it. And we are still making first today. The other thing about STEM is mathematics is the foundation of STEM. When you look at a physicist, they have to know a lot of math and vice versa. When you talk about engineers, Mary Jackson worked for NASA, and she was a human computer, which meant she did math. Day in and day out, she did math. But in actuality, she wanted to be an engineer. And the only thing keeping her from being an engineer was taking some classes, because she was basically doing all the work that the engineers did. In fact, she was feeding the engineers the math that they needed to do the engineering work. So she eventually did become an engineer at NASA. So these things are very connected. So when we talk about the mathematicians have so many different careers. It's not, I think some people think when you get a PhD in math, that the only thing you can do is teach. Well, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, so I'm not saying that to belittle that. I think that that's great that we have people that want to teach the younger people. But there are so many other things that you can do. There's one, Dr. Shelby Wilson in the book. She actually works in a physics lab. We have somebody else, I think it's Monica Jackson, I think, and she does work with data where she looks at diseases and how mathematics plays a role in figuring out how are the diseases going to spread. I mean, look at the pandemic we're in right now, COVID-19. We're learning so much about the math. We're seeing all the different graphs that they show. They wouldn't be able to do that without mathematics and seeing how things are doubling. So there's mathematics in a lot of what we do. So again, I have the first, and I told you who the three first are. I want to talk about the pioneer Gloria Gilmer. I have many pioneers in the book, but Gloria Gilmer, the reason I want to talk about her is she actually wrote about the mathematics of African American women's hairstyles. She talked about how box braids, and she showed us the box braids, and she talked about how we can count the number of braids in the hair using a mathematics formula. And so she actually went to a hairstylist, and she looked at how she was braiding, and she asked her some questions, and the hairstylist talked about how she sort of rotates how if I have these braids on this row, the next row is going to be shifted over one, so that when the hair lays down, it's sort of the hair on top, the braid on top is falling into the part of the hair on the bottom, so that it lays flat and it's not all bunched up. And we call that a tessellation. And even cornrows, if you think of cornrows, it's usually in a pattern. Whatever we do on one side of the head is reflected on the other side. Or we might do a cone in the middle and it goes up like a fractal. So we have something called fractals. You can find that in Black women's hairstyles, cornrows. You can find tessellations. You can find something called triangular numbers. How do I know this? Because I read about it. I learn about the different women, and I broaden our thoughts about what math is. We have one of the mathematicians in my book right now, I can't think of her name, and she looks at hurricane surges, and and it started after Katrina. It made her interested to know, well, why did this happen? Why did we get this amount of water here and not here? And so she looked at the different surges of the water because of the hurricanes. So there's mathematics in everything we do. I think that as teachers, whether you teach K-8, whether you teach high school, whether you teach college, if you can find mathematicians of color, in my case, I research African American women mathematicians, but if you can find mathematicians of color to highlight in your classroom, that's a start. And if you can find out, well, what did they contribute to mathematics? What did the African people contribute to mathematics? So much, right? A lot of times we'll learn about Pythagoras or we'll learn about Gauss, but we won't learn about what the African people contributed to math. And so we have to look at things like that. And that's some of the things I try to do in my classroom, is to broaden what people think of when we say math. I don't want them to only think of Pythagoras. I like Pythagoras. I like the Pythagoras theorem, but I don't want them to only think of certain people. I want them to think of Benjamin Banneker in addition to Katherine Johnson, John Urschel. I want them to see mathematicians' names and know, hey, that's a mathematician. He was a football player, a former football player, but he's also a mathematician. Because sometimes we don't think athletes can do other things, they usually do other things. They're college graduates. So they have other fields that they're interested in. And so those are the things that we need to teach kids, is that, okay, this great athlete also does this other thing, whatever it might be.
I just love how you're constantly making real life connections and cultural connections that allow students and allow other people to understand that math is really outside of the box. Sometimes we look at math as it's in the box and it has to be done one way. But as you're talking, I'm really learning for myself that math is in everything we do and everywhere. And, it's allowing me to broaden my mindset on how I look at math. And even like you said, with just sports and, people that have careers and professions, they're not just sticking to one thing as well. So, it's definitely multifaceted. So as we, go along to the last question, I just would like to ask you just more information about your research with teachers on culturally relevant math and how you're helping them to become multifaceted, and just how you're helping them to be mindful of the different ways that they can incorporate math as well as connecting it to real life.
I just want to say the name of the mathematician I was talking about. Her name is Dr. Talia Mayo. I'm so sorry, Talia. I don't know why I was forgetting your name, but she's part of the Contemporary First. And there's so many mathematicians that I didn't mention in my book, but I actually was just learning then. Like, I had never thought about it that way. And all of a sudden, after Hidden Figures, I got on to MAD, the Mathematicians of the African Diaspora. It's a website. And I just started learning so much about Black women. And I was like, wow, I never learned this in school. And then there's another website called Mathematically Gifted and Black. And that's another website to learn about mathematicians of the African diaspora. So there's a lot that we can learn. The research that I'm doing right now actually is partially funded by the Center for Educational Opportunity at Albany State University. So again, shout out to you all for having the foresight to say, there are people that want to do the work, and sometimes we need assistance, right? And so what I'm doing in my research myself, and I have a graduate student, Raina Dunham Northup. She got married maybe a year ago. And I knew Raina since she was an undergrad, and she worked in a summer program. She was one of my counselors in a summer program. And then she went on to get her master's, and now she is getting a doctorate, I believe. I think she's in the doctorate program, the doctoral program. But anyway, so Raina and myself were working together on this. And I was really happy to have a student kind of professor relationship with her. So what we did was we recruited teachers from all over the country through social media, through emailing people that we know and saying, hey, try to find some people in your area. For instance, like there's an organization called the Benjamin Banneker Association, and it's an association of just educators, some math educators, but we all teach math, even if we're like, K to 6, we all teach math. So some are math teachers, some are classroom teachers that also teach math. But so anyway, we have, I think, 45 teachers. We were trying to get one teacher from every state, but we didn't get that. But we did get teachers from each region of the country. And we have professional learning opportunities where we'll have like Zoom meetings where like the first meeting was just sort of what is culturally relevant teaching? What is it all about? So I did a PowerPoint and teachers learned about what it means. And then we had discussions, and we spent a lot of time just introducing ourselves just so we can know each other, so we can become a community. And then the second professional learning session was more about, okay, there are teachers that are already trying this in their classrooms. So we had teachers report out about, what have you done so far in your classroom? How have students reacted to it? What are you learning about yourself as an educator and about your students? And so that was our second session. Now in the fall, once teachers get back to school, they're all going to use this template that I created. It's called, what is it called? Transforming transforming a math task into a culturally relevant math task. And it's sort of just a template to help them to say, okay, this is a math task that I already do in my curriculum. How can I change this? Well, first of all, I have to choose a task that's already cognitively demanding. So it can't be a task that's just memorization. What's 4 times 8? No, that's not a cognitively demanding task. It might be for a second grader, but I want a task that's more, it's multifaceted, right? Something that students have to actually not know the immediate answer to it. Then I say, okay, how can I infuse culture into it? Okay, how can I use community funds of knowledge? How could I either do a mirror or a window? So there's this opportunity for teachers to think about, who was it? Rudine Sims Bishop. In literature, she said, kids need to see themselves in books when they read books. Well, the same thing in math. Kids need to see themselves. That's the mirror. Kids also need to learn about others. That's the window. And then she also says sliding doors where, they can like step into something new. But in math, we talk about the mirrors and the window, meaning, will I use something that reflects my students, or are they going to learn about others? And you want to make sure you have a balance of, they're not always learning about others. Sometimes they have to learn about themselves. And that might mean learning about the contributions of Hispanic, Latinx mathematicians, or Black mathematicians, or just mathematicians of color, or scientists of color. It could be that, or it could be community funds of knowledge where we're using all of those examples that I gave you earlier. So teachers take a lesson that they already have, make it more culturally relevant, teach it, and then they reflect on, how did I make it more culturally relevant? Did the kids react differently to it? And then in September, we'll come back. October, we'll come back and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that template, how they created a culturally relevant math task, and then reflect on how it worked. So that's basically what the research is about. And then myself and Raina, we will write an article about it to tell other teachers how to do it. But then we'll also have some of the participants who are teachers, we'll have them write an article as well from their perspective. So Raina and I will write a research article. The teachers will write an article, more of a practice, so that other teachers will know, well, how did this work from a teacher's perspective? And so that's our research. And we hope that through the Benjamin Banneker, what we're hoping is that, and also through NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Math, we're hoping that we can disseminate this information so that teachers all over the country and even in Canada can learn more about culturally relevant teaching in math, and specifically about math tasks.
Well, I look forward to reading your research article, and it sounds like it's going to be a phenomenal study. Well, as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you so much for being on our EdYOUcate podcast, and it was such a pleasure having you on here.
You have just completed the most recent episode of the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for listening to the most fired up educational podcast out. Tune in every first Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. during the 2021 through 2022 academic year.